Chapter 1. An Unfamiliar Signature. The alley smelled of wet brick and old garbage. Rain fell in a fine, persistent mist, clinging to the fabric of Holly's crew's coat and making the pavement gleam under the harsh glare of a portable floodlight. He stood over the body, a still shape beneath a yellow tarp, and felt a profound and unsettling emptiness. It was the absence of a connection, a cold void where a professional instinct should have been. Officer Una Park stood beside him, her presence a small, solid point in the swirling disorientation. "Third one," she said, her voice low and even. Same presentation. No signs of struggle. The poem was pinned to his collar. She held up a plastic evidence bag. Inside, a small, cream-colored card was stark against the dark alley. The script on it was exquisite, a cascade of perfect calligraphy rendered in a deep, sepia-toned ink. Holly stared at it. The words were meaningless shapes. He could read them, process their definitions, but the artistry, the intent, the signature of the killer, it was a foreign language. "He calls himself the calligrapher," Park continued, watching his face. "This victim is Simon Gable, a librarian, found by the sanitation crew an hour ago." Hollis gave a slow nod, a gesture he had learned was expected of him. He crouched, his knees protesting. He lifted a corner of the tarp. Simon Gable's face was placid, his eyes open to the drizzling sky. There was a strange tranquility to the corpse, a stillness that went beyond death. Pinned to the man's lapel was a single, desiccated moth. Its wings bore a pattern uncannily like a human skull. "The moth," Hollis murmured, his own voice sounding distant. "Death's head hawk moth," Park supplied instantly. "Same as the others. Bethany Shaw, the historian, Marcus Thorne, the linguist, people who worked with the past, with records." He dropped the tarp. He should have patterns clicking into place. He should have theories forming, a web of connections spinning in his mind. He had been, they told him, a brilliant detective. His mind was a weapon. Now it was a museum of his own life with every exhibit shrouded in a white sheet. He walked through the halls, recognizing nothing. "What do I see, Park?" he asked. The question was a desperate one, a plea for a mirror. Park's expression did not change, but her eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "You see the ink. You see the precision. You see a man who values control above everything else. You said he wasn't killing them. You said he was archiving them." Hollis processed the words, archiving. It sounded like something he would say. It had the right ring of obsessive, detached analysis. It meant nothing to him. He straightened up and turned away from the body, his gaze sweeping the filthy brick walls of the alley. His eyes scanned fire escapes, grimy windows, the dark maw of a dumpster. He was hunting for something out of place, a flicker of wrongness. It was a physical process now, not a mental one. His body remembered the hunt better than his mind. A scuffling sound came from the alley's mouth. A dog stood there, a scruffy terrier mixed with one floppy ear and fur the color of dirty pavement. It watched him, its tail giving a single, hopeful thump against a trash can. The animal was familiar. A pang, not quite a memory but the shape of one, echoed in the emptiness of his head. "Hey, Scrap," Park said, a small smile touching her lips. "He still remembers you, Hollis." Hollis stared at the dog, Scrap. The name felt right. He took a hesitant step forward. The The dog whined, a low, eager sound, and trotted toward him, nudging its wet head against his leg. Hollis reached down, his hand automatically finding the spot behind the dog's ears. The animal leaned into his touch with a sigh of contentment. The interaction felt practiced, a piece of muscle memory from a life he could not access. He had known this dog. He had cared for this dog. The knowledge was a splinter under his skin. He straightened again, his hand falling from the animal's fur. His fingers brushed against something small and hard in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was ornate with a complex floral head. He had no idea what it opened. He had found it in this coat the morning he woke up in the hospital, the morning his world had been erased. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia, a trauma response. They asked him about a blood drive van seen near his apartment. He remembered nothing. Captain Marcus Cole pushed his way through the uniformed officers at the tape. His face, perpetually sour, was slick with rain. He ignored Park and fixed his gaze on Hollis. "Crew, what have you got?" Cole's voice was a low growl of impatience. He saw Hollis not as a man, but as a malfunctioning piece of equipment. Hollis turned the key over in his palm. He had nothing. He had a dead librarian, a fancy note, a moth, and a dog he apparently knew. He looked at Park, a silent admission of his own uselessness. Park stepped forward, her posture solid. "The killer is escalating, Captain. The time between victims is shrinking. The target profile is consistent. Detective Crew was just pointing out the lack of defensive wounds, the almost ceremonial placement of the body." Cole grunted, his eyes narrowing at Hollis. "Is that right, Crew, you pointing that out? Or is she your ventriloquist now?" Hollis met the captain's gaze. He could offer no defense. He could not articulate the complex theories that Park claimed he once held. The silence stretched, thick and damning. Scrap, sensing the tension, let out a low growl from beside his leg. "Get something," Cole finally bit out, "or I'm handing this whole circus to someone whose brain is still firing on all cylinders." He turned and shouldered his way back through the crowd, a man who had delivered his verdict. The weight of his condition pressed down on Hollis. He was a ghost piloting his own body. He looked from the key in his hand to the alley to the waiting dog. His past self had left him clues. A key, a dog, a partner who remembered who he was supposed to be. These were the only tools he had left to hunt a monster he had apparently understood completely, once upon a time. The thought was a cold dread that settled deep in his gut. The calligrapher was out there, painting his masterpieces of death across the city. And Hollis' Crew, the one man who could supposedly stop him, was a stranger to himself, holding a key to a door he could not find. Scrap whined again and nudged his hand, as if trying to pull a memory from him through touch alone. It was no use. The room was empty. Chapter 2: The Ghost on the Page. The precinct smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, greenish glow on the rows of gray desks. Hollis sat at his own, a scarred metal island in a sea of organized chaos. The calligrapher's case file was open before him. It was thick, meticulously organized. Unipark had assembled it, but the soul of it, the driving intelligence, was his. Or it had been. He stared at a crime scene photograph of the first victim, Bethany Shaw. She lay in the rare books section of the city archives, her body arranged in a high-backed leather chair. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked like she had fallen asleep reading. A poem about fading ink and forgotten stories was propped on a bookstand before her. "Your handwriting," he said, tapping a page of notes beside the photo. The script was sharp, angular, almost illegible with speed. It was his own. He did not recognize it. "You wrote that after we found her," Park said from her desk opposite his. She did not look up from her monitor. "You dictated for 3 hours straight, filled half a notebook. You said the killer had librarian's hands. You noticed the lack of smudging on the ink, the precise fold of the card. You were certain he worked with delicate documents for a living." Hollis picked up the page. The words swam. Obsessive, patient, narcissistic personality with a God complex. Sees his victims not as people but as artifacts. The murder is the final, perfect entry in their catalog. It was a brilliant piece of psychoanalysis. A complete stranger had written it using his hand. He flipped through more pages, reports he had written, witness interviews he had conducted, a world of painstaking work completely alien to him. He felt a spike of frustration, a hot, useless anger at the man who had been Holly's crew. That man had all the answers. That man had left him here to drown. "The bloodmobile," he said, changing the subject. "Anything." Park finally swiveled her chair to face him. Her expression was tired. "Finn is running checks, trying to find a company that operates a vintage-style donation van. A 1970s model, according to the one witness who saw it near your building. So far, nothing official. It's a ghost." "A ghost that took my life," Hollis muttered. "We don't know that for certain," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "What else could it be?" he shot back, his voice harsher than he intended. "One day I'm hunting a killer, the next I can't remember my own address. Something happened in that van." Park held his gaze. "I believe you, but Cole thinks you're cracking under the pressure of the case. He's looking for any excuse to put you on permanent leave." The threat hung in the air between them. Without this case, without Park, he had nothing. He was just a man with a missing past and a key to an unknown lock. In a quiet, climate-controlled room deep within the city records office, Julian Pike ran a gloved finger down a row of crumbling leather-bound ledgers. The air smelled of old paper and decaying glue. He loved that smell. It was the scent of permanence, of history captured and held against the ravages of time. He pulled a heavy volume from the shelf and carried it to a large oak table. He opened it carefully. The 1890 census records. A city of ghosts, their lives reduced to a name, an age, an occupation. He traced a name with his finger. Eleonora Vance, seamstress, 23. A life forgotten by everyone, but not by him. Here in this book she was immortal. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Claire, entered the room. "Mr. Pike, there was a call for you from the police." Julian looked up, his expression one of mild, pleasant curiosity. "Oh, and what did they want?" "They were asking about access logs for the archives. Specifically, they wanted to know if Bethany Shaw had any visitors in the weeks before her death." "And you told them what I instructed?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yes, that the security system was down for upgrades during that period, that the paper logs were unfortunately misplaced." She wrung her hands. "Was that all right, Mr. Pike?" "It was perfect, Claire. You are a model of efficiency," he said, giving her a small, reassuring smile. She scurried away, relieved. Julian turned his attention back to the ledger. The police. Detective Holly's crew. He had followed the detective's career for years. Crew was a magnificent instrument, a man who saw the beauty in patterns, the art in obsession. He was the only one in this city of sleeping masses who could truly appreciate Julian's work. He had read the news reports about the detective's sudden, bizarre breakdown. Amnesia. It was fascinating. A blank canvas. The greatest mind he had ever faced wiped clean. Julian had been disappointed at first. A game without a worthy opponent was no game at all. But then a new, more exquisite idea had begun to form. Perhaps the game wasn't over. Perhaps it had just entered a more interesting phase. He could not only present his art to the great detective crew, he could teach it to him. He could rebuild the detective's mind in the image of his own investigation. It was a beautiful, symmetrical concept, an artist's ultimate tribute to his only critic. He closed the heavy census book. In his work area, beneath a soft light, a small terrarium sat on a shelf. Inside, several large caterpillars chewed methodically on milkweed leaves. Soon, they would begin their transformation. He would have a fresh supply of messengers for his new lessons. The Bloodmobile was parked on a tree-lined street in a quiet residential neighborhood. It was a cheerful-looking vehicle, painted a bright, clean white with a reassuring red cross on the side. A simple sign was propped on the grass beside it. "Be a hero. Give the gift of life." Vernon sat in the driver's seat, humming a tuneless, cheerful melody. He adjusted his friendly-looking cardigan and smiled as a young woman approached the van. She was a jogger, flushed and healthy. "Good afternoon," Vernon called out through the open window. "Beautiful day to save a life, isn't it?" "I guess so," the woman said, slowing to a stop. "I've always meant to donate." "No time like the present," Vernon said with an avuncular charm. "Process is quick and easy. You'll be back on your run in a jiffy, and you get a free cookie." The woman smiled and agreed. Inside the van, it was clean, sterile, and surprisingly modern. She lay on the comfortable recliner. Vernon was a picture of gentle efficiency. He swabbed her arm, his hand steady, his voice a soothing murmur. "You won't feel a thing," he promised. The needle went in. It was a strange-looking needle with a complex, almost organic-looking mechanism at its base, but the woman barely noticed. A machine beside the chair began to hum, a low, resonant frequency. The woman's eyes grew heavy. She felt a pleasant, drifting sensation, as if floating on a warm sea. Vernon watched a small gauge on the machine. He wasn't watching the bag fill with blood. He was watching a different meter, one that measured something less tangible. He saw flashes of images on a small screen beside the gauge. A childhood birthday party, a first kiss in the rain, the grief of losing a grandparent, the joy of a college graduation. A life distilled into flickering ghosts of light. When the gauge was full, the humming stopped. The needle retracted with a soft click. "There now," Vernon said, patting her arm. "You did a wonderful thing today." He helped her sit up. The woman blinked slowly, her expression placid. The vibrant energy she had possessed just minutes before was gone, replaced by a calm, incurious emptiness. She looked around the van as if seeing it for the first time. "Here's your cookie," Vernon said, pressing the small, packaged treat into her hand. She took it without a word and walked out of the van. She did not resume her jog. She began to walk home at a slow, steady pace, her expression serene and vacant. She was a hollow now, another successful harvest. Vernon tidied his station, his cheerful humming resuming. It was a good day's work. Miles away at the precinct, Holly's crew stared at a fax that had just arrived. It was addressed specifically to him. There was no text, just a single, perfect sentence of calligraphy, a copy of something he himself had written in the case file. "The killer is building a museum of memory." The calligrapher hadn't just read his notes. He was quoting them. He was inside Holly's own investigation. He was inside his head. Chapter 3: The Echo in the Bone. The brass key felt heavy and cold in Holly's hand. It was an anchor to a past he couldn't reach, a solid object in a world that had become thin and unreal. His apartment was a stranger's home, filled with books he didn't remember reading and clothes he didn't remember choosing. Park had told him it was his, had driven him here from the hospital. He still felt like a trespasser. He tried the key on every lock in the apartment, the front door, a small lockbox in his closet, a diary on his nightstand. Nothing. It fit none of them. Frustration gnawed at him. His former self had been a man of purpose, of secrets. He had left this key for a reason. Scrap, who had followed him home from the crime scene and refused to leave, whined from the living room floor. The dog was watching him with an unnerving intelligence, as if waiting for him to solve a puzzle it already understood. Holly's ran a hand over his face. He was tired. The emptiness in his head was a physical weight. He walked into the bedroom and stood before the closet again. It was filled with drab, functional suits and shirts, a detective's uniform. At the bottom, beneath a pile of shoes, was a large, military-style footlocker. It was plain green metal with no visible lock. He had dismissed it before. He ran his hand along its side, feeling for a seam, a latch. His fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible keyhole, cleverly hidden in the hinge mechanism. His breath hitched. He slid the brass key into the hole. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. He lifted the heavy lid. The footlocker was not filled with old uniforms or mementos. It was packed with files, notebooks, and loose photographs. It was a second, secret case file. His real case file on the calligrapher. He lifted out a notebook. The pages were covered in his own frantic scrawl. They were a chaotic mess of arrows, circled names, and cryptic phrases. Unlike the official file, this one was pure, uncut obsession. He saw names he did not recognize connected to maps of the city. He saw chemical formulas for different types of ink. He saw sketches of the moth, annotated with its life cycle. It was the work of a madman or a genius. He could not tell which. He saw the intricate patterns the other detective had woven, but he could not feel the threads. He was looking at the blueprints for a cathedral, unable to imagine the stone and glass. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He slammed the notebook shut. This wasn't helping. It was just a more detailed portrait of the man he had failed to be. He decided to move. Thinking was a dead end. Action was all he had left. "Come on," he said to the dog. Scrap was on his feet in an instant, his tail wagging. He didn't have a destination. He simply walked out of his apartment building and let the dog lead. Scrap trotted ahead with a confident air, navigating the city streets as if following a familiar route. He led Hollies away from the main thoroughfares, into a neighborhood of old brick walk-ups and small, family-owned businesses. The dog stopped in front of a diner. "The Blue Plate," read the faded neon sign. It was a classic, narrow place with a long counter and red vinyl booths. Scrap sat by the door, looking up at Hollies expectantly. Hollies pushed the door open. A small bell chimed. The place smelled of coffee and fried onions. An older woman behind the counter looked up, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Hollies, haven't seen you in a week. The usual?" she asked. The question hit him like a physical blow. The usual. This was a place he came. This woman knew him. He had a usual. The simple, friendly question highlighted the chasm between his past and present. "Not today, Maria," he managed, reading her name from the tag on her uniform. Her smile faltered. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," he said. He sat at the counter, the vinyl cool against his skin. Scrap padded in and lay down at his feet. As he sat there, a strange sensation prickled at the base of his skull. A somatic marker, the police psychologist had called it, the body's memory. He felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of sadness, of grief. It was sharp and overwhelming. It did not feel like his own. He looked around the diner. His gaze fell on a photograph hanging on the wall, a group shot of a youth orchestra. In the back row, a young woman with a cello smiled out at the camera. He felt a connection to her, a phantom pain. "Who is that?" he asked Maria, pointing to the photo. Maria's face clouded. "Oh, that's Bethany Shaw. Her group used to come in here after practice. A sweet girl. What happened to her? It's a tragedy. You were the one who told me, remember? You came in here the day after, asking if she'd said anything if she seemed worried." Bethany Shaw, the first victim, the historian. He had been here. He had sat on this very stool, his mind whole, and investigated her death. He had felt the loss of her. And now all that remained of that connection was this ghost of an emotion, an echo in his bones that he could not trace to its source. He was a walking crime scene, the evidence of his own past life wiped clean. His phone buzzed. It was Park. "Hollies, where are you?" "A diner, the Blue Plate." "Stay there, we have a problem." 10 minutes later, Park slid into the stool next to him. She looked grim. "I just got out of a meeting with Cole. He's furious you left the precinct. He's officially pulling you from the calligrapher case. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately." The words landed without impact. He was already adrift. What was one more snapped rope? "He can't do that," Hollies said, the protest sounding weak even to himself. He can, and he did, Park countered. He said you're a danger to yourself and the investigation. He thinks you're obsessed and unstable. The killer knows about my condition, Yuna, he said, his voice low and urgent. He's playing with me, quoting my own notes. This is personal. I know and I believe you, but Cole won't listen. She leaned closer. We're on our own with this now, Hollies. Officially, I'm just checking on a colleague's welfare. Unofficially, she let the sentence hang. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. They were outside the lines now. A rogue investigation with a broken detective and his loyal partner. It was a terrible, desperate plan. It was the only one they had. He pushed himself off the stool and walked out of the diner, Park following close behind. The city air felt cold. He was no longer a detective. He was just a man being hunted, his own past a weapon turned against him. When he got back to his apartment later that night, the feeling of being a trespasser was stronger than ever. Scrap was sniffing anxiously at the base of the living room window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Hollies walked over to see what had agitated the dog. Clinging to the outside of the glass, its wings gently beating against the pane, was a single death's head hawk moth. It was looking in. The calligrapher had been here. He had stood right outside, marking his territory, observing his broken plaything. The thin barrier of glass between Hollies and the moth felt like no barrier at all. Chapter 4: A Map of Scars. The moth on the window was a declaration of war. Julian Pike was no longer content to play his game from a distance. He had breached the perimeter of Hollies' life, turning his home from a sanctuary into a stage. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant, low-grade hum of dread beneath the surface of everything. Hollies found himself checking locks, peering out his window at shadows, sleeping in brief, dreamless snatches with the footlocker of his past life open on the floor beside him. 2 days later the call came. Park's voice was tight, strained. There's another one, a new body. Where? Hollies asked, already pulling on his coat. Scrap watched him from the couch, alert and whining softly. You won't like it, she said. It's an antique shop on 4th Street. Abernathy's Pens and Inks. The name meant nothing to Hollies, but he could hear the significance in her tone. Who was he? Mr. Abernathy, an elderly gentleman. You interviewed him a month ago. He was the city's foremost expert on historical inks. He was the one who identified the specific iron gall ink the calligrapher uses. A key witness. A man Hollies himself had placed on the killer's radar. The message was brutally clear. Anyone you touch, I can reach. Anything you knew, I can erase. They met a block from the crime scene, away from the official police presence. Park handed him a visitor's badge from a different precinct. You're a consultant from the archives, here to look at the historical value of the stock, she said. Keep your head down. Cole will have a fit if he sees you. The shop was a small, cluttered space, smelling of dust, wood polish, and something metallic and cloying. Mr. Abernathy was behind his display counter, slumped in his chair. He looked peaceful, much like the other victims. The calligrapher's cruel signature was pinned to his sweater, a moth and a cream-colored card. Hollies moved closer, ignoring the forensics team, and read the poem. The calligraphy was as perfect as ever. The penman's hand is still, his knowledge fled. A final, silent story for the dead. He sold the ink that writes this fading line. A tool of memory, no longer thine. The last line was a direct address, no longer thine. It was a taunt aimed squarely at Holly's. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The killer was not just murdering people. He was systematically dismantling Holly's past investigation, piece by piece. He was killing the witnesses, destroying the evidence, salting the earth of a life Holly's could not even remember. "Look at this," Park murmured, directing his attention to the glass countertop. Next to the victim's hand, the killer had arranged a display. A half-dozen old photographs were laid out in a neat row. They were crime scene photos, duplicates from old cases. Holly's recognized the grim tableaus of death, but not the context. "These are your cases," Park explained, her voice barely a whisper. "Your first homicide, the waterfront strangler case, the apartment fire on Oakhaven. These are all your triumphs, cases you solved." The calligrapher was showing him the man he used to be, a gallery of his forgotten successes. It was a monument to his own inadequacy. He looked closer at one of the photos, a black and white image of a crowd of onlookers standing behind a police line. He saw the usual faces, curious, grim, morbid. But one man stood out. He was in the middle of the crowd, but his face was strangely indistinct, almost blurred, as if the camera's lens had slipped out of focus only on him. "The Hollows," Holly's breathed, the term coming to him unbidden. Park nodded grimly. "We've been seeing them more and more, people who just check out. They walk, they talk, they work, but they're empty. We started noticing them in the backgrounds of photos, always slightly out of focus. Finn calls it psychic redaction, like reality itself can't quite get a grip on them." She paused. "They all live on the routes the bloodmobile takes." The two halves of the nightmare were clicking together. A killer who worshipped memory and a predator that consumed it. They were moving through his city like two sharks in the same water. Were they connected? Or was it just a terrible, cosmic coincidence? They left the scene before Captain Cole could arrive. Back in Park's unmarked car, the silence was heavy. Holly's felt like he was chasing a phantom, his own ghost, through a city that was slowly being hollowed out. "Finn found something," Park said, breaking the quiet. She pulled a tablet from her bag and handed it to him. "He's been tracking the bloodmobile sightings, trying to find a pattern. The route is erratic, nonsensical. It jumps from one side of the city to the other." On the screen was a map of the city, dotted with red pins marking the van's appearances. "But then he overlaid the locations of the calligrapher's victims," she continued, tapping the screen. A new set of blue pins appeared. Still nothing, just chaos. She tapped the screen again. "This is where it gets strange." Finn was looking at the donation logs he managed to hack. They're mostly garbage data, but he found a weird, encrypted signal embedded in them. A low-frequency carrier wave. When he mapped the signal's origin points, he got this. A green line snaked across the map, connecting the red pins in a bizarre, looping pattern. It looked like a child's scribble. But where the green line intersected with the blue victim pins, a pattern emerged. The Bloodmobile had always been within a few blocks of the calligrapher's victims within 48 hours of their deaths. Always. It's not a coincidence, Holly said. The certainty of it was a solid thing in the chaos of his mind. They're connected. The harvester is clearing a path or cleaning up, erasing something. Erasing what? Witnesses, the killer, Park asked, her brow furrowed. I don't know. He traced the green line on the map with his finger. It was a map of scars, a secret road winding through the city. But we need to find that truck. As if on cue, Park's phone chimed with a notification. It was an alert she had set up. City traffic cam just spotted it, she said, her voice electric. The Bloodmobile, it's parked. Right now. Where? She showed him the screen. A live feed showed the cheerful white van parked on a quiet street. Vernon, the driver, was just getting out, a clipboard in his hand. That's on the west side, Park said. Nowhere near any of the crime scenes. Hollis zoomed in on the image. He could see the building Vernon was approaching. It was a small, local medical clinic. He felt another somatic jolt, a wave of cold dread so intense it made him nauseous. This feeling was not an echo of a past event. It was a premonition. He looked at Park, the name of the clinic visible on the awning in the video feed. Una, he said, his voice tight with a fear he did not understand. That's where my ex-wife works. At that moment, the precinct's main dispatch line began to ring. An officer answered it, his voice bored. City homicide, how can I help you? Le pause. Sir, this is a homicide line. If you have a tip, I can take it. Another pause. The officer's posture straightened. He began scribbling furiously on a notepad. Who is this? The officer demanded. The voice on the other end was calm, articulate, and cold, and it had a simple request. I have some information about the blood donation van, the voice said, but I will only provide it to Detective Holly's crew. Julian Pike had made his move. He wanted to talk to the man he was breaking. Chapter 5. The Voice in the Static. The phone call turned the squad room into a pressure cooker. Every sound was magnified, the frantic clicking of Finn's keyboard as he tried to trace the call, the low murmur of officers trying to listen in, the steady, rhythmic thump of Hollis's own heart. He sat at his desk, the receiver slick with sweat in his hand. Julian Pike was on the other end of the line, a ghost made of static and malice. Detective Crew, the voice said, smooth and academic. A pleasure to finally speak with you. I do hope I'm not interrupting. Holly said nothing. Park stood behind him out of sight, a whiteboard in her hands. On it she scrawled a single word, stall. I admire your work, detective, the calligrapher continued, his tone conversational. Or, I should say, I admired it. Your monograph on symbolic staging in ritualistic crimes was a masterpiece of insight. A shame you can no longer appreciate it. The killer knew. He wasn't just guessing, he knew the specifics. He knew the intimate details of Hollis's intellectual life. The violation was profound. What do you want? Hollis managed, his voice a dry rasp. I want a conversation, an exchange of ideas. I've been leaving you my work, my art, and you have been unresponsive. I thought a more direct approach was in order. On the whiteboard, Park wrote, "Ask about VERNON." "The blood van," Holly said, forcing the words out. "You have information about it." A soft chuckle came down the line. "Ah, yes, the little white truck with the folksy driver. A fascinating specimen. A mindless vacuum cleaner of the soul. Tell me, detective, what does it feel like? The emptiness. Is it peaceful, or is it a constant, nagging itch where a life used to be?" The question was a scalpel expertly inserted. Hollies felt a flash of white-hot rage. This man was dissecting him, taking pleasure in his brokenness. Scrap, sensing his master's distress, growled from under the desk. The sound was low, almost subliminal. The dog's growl sparked something in Hollies, an idea, an instinct. He looked at the open footlocker by his desk, at the chaotic scrawl of his former self. He couldn't use logic. He had none left. But maybe he could use the killer's own obsession against him. Park wrote a new instruction: keep him talking. Motive. "You think memory is art," Holly said, ignoring her instruction for a moment. He was following a thread he couldn't see. "You preserve it." "I do," Julian said, his voice warming with enthusiasm. "Memory is the only currency of the soul. It is what separates us from beasts. To live a life and have it forgotten is the ultimate tragedy. I provide a service. I ensure my subjects are remembered forever, immortalized at their peak." "And the bloodmobile," Hollies pressed. "What is that?" "It does the opposite. It erases." "An excellent point," the killer exclaimed, genuinely delighted. "Order and chaos, creation and oblivion. They are two sides of the same beautiful coin, are they not? One cannot exist without the other. The harvester, as I call it, provides the blank canvas upon which I paint my masterpieces. It creates the silence against which my poetry can be properly heard." Finn shook his head frantically. The call was bouncing between half a dozen relays. Untraceable. Park scribbled again. "His mistake. Ask about a mistake." Hollies ignored her again. He was somewhere else, lost in a fragment of intuition. Scrap nudged his leg, then barked once, a sharp, insistent sound aimed at the mess of notes on the floor. Hollies' eyes darted down. He saw a name circled over and over again in red ink: Sadie Finch. The name was meaningless to him, but the dog's reaction was undeniable. This was important. This was a piece his former self had fixated on. "Sadie Finch," Hollies said into the phone. The name was a shot in the dark. The line went silent. For the first time, the calligrapher's placid, arrogant composure was broken. The silence stretched for 3, 4, 5 seconds. It was a lifetime. "I don't know who that is," Julian Pike said finally, but his voice had changed. It was tighter, colder. The mask had slipped. Hollies pressed, emboldened by the killer's reaction. "You know her. She's a part of your design. Something went wrong with her, didn't it?" He had no idea what he was saying, but it felt right. He was channeling the ghost of the other Hollies, the brilliant detective who had seen this connection. "Our conversation is over, detective," the killer snapped. The line went dead. Hollies slammed the receiver down. The squad room was silent. Everyone was staring at him. "What was that?" Park demanded. "Who is Sadie Finch?" "I don't know," Hollies admitted, breathing heavily. But he does. The name was all over my private notes. The dog, Scrap reacted to it. Finn swiveled in his chair. Holly's, while he was talking, I was able to isolate the carrier signal for his scrambler. It's a military-grade encryption, but the signal's point of origin. It's not a phone. It's coming from a terminal hardwired into the city's municipal network. Can you find it? Park asked. Not without a direct access code. But there are only a few places with that kind of terminal. City Hall, the main library, and the Central Records Office. The Records Office, where the first victim, Bethany Shaw, had worked, where a man with librarian's hands would feel right at home. It wasn't proof, but it was the first solid lead they had. "Let's go," Holly said, rising to his feet. But as he moved, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. There was no message, just a photo. It was a picture of the bloodmobile. It was parked, but it was no longer outside the clinic. It was now directly in front of his ex-wife's apartment building, 2 blocks away. The back doors of the van were open. Standing in the doorway was Vernon, his gentle, grandfatherly face smiling benevolently. He was holding up a small, packaged cookie, as if making an offering. Standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the van with a serene, empty expression was Jenna Crew, his ex-wife. She was reaching out to take the cookie. The killer's phone call hadn't been the main event. It was a diversion, a way to keep Holly's pinned to his desk, helpless, while the harvester claimed the one person left from his past that Julian Pike hadn't yet touched. The game had reached a new, horrifying level. The blank canvas the killer wanted was no longer just Holly's mind. It was his entire world. Chapter 6: The Shape of a Ghost. The text message was a photograph of a nightmare. It burned itself onto the back of Holly's eyes. The cheerful white van, the open doors like the mouth of a tomb, the placid smile of the man named Vernon, and Jenna. His Jenna. Reaching for the cookie, her expression one of serene, untroubled emptiness. The world narrowed to a single, roaring point of focus. "Jenna," he breathed. The sound was not a word but a raw nerve. He was moving before he consciously decided to, a blind surge of adrenaline and terror. He shouldered past a bewildered Finn, his chair screeching back on its casters. Park was right behind him, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the rising clamor of the squad room. "Holly's, wait. We need a plan." There was no plan. There was only the image, the van, Jenna. The time for plans had been eaten, harvested, and stored away in some dark, humming machine. He hit the stairwell door with enough force to make the metal frame shudder. He took the steps 3 at a time, his lungs burning, the brass key in his pocket digging into his thigh. Scrap was a frantic, barking blur, somehow sensing the shift from tension to outright crisis. They burst out onto the street, the city lights smearing in the damp night air. Park's car was at the curb, its engine already rumbling. She had anticipated his flight. She grabbed his arm, her grip like steel. "Get in, I'll drive," she commanded. "You're in no state." He didn't argue. He collapsed into the passenger seat, the world outside the window a meaningless streak of color. Scrap scrambled into the back, whining, his claws clicking on the plastic floor mat. The drive was a frantic, siren-blasting tear through the city's arteries. Holly stared at his phone, at the picture. He kept zooming in on Jenna's face, searching for a flicker of recognition, of fear, of anything. There was nothing, just a placid emptiness, a terrifying peace. She looked like a stranger wearing his ex-wife's face. They screeched to a halt in front of her apartment building. The street was quiet. The bloodmobile was gone. A profound and terrible silence hung in the air where the van had been. "Police!" Park yelled, shouldering the main door open. They took the stairs to the third floor, their footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Jenna's apartment door was ajar. Holly's pushed it open slowly. The apartment was neat, tidy, exactly as he didn't remember it. And in the center of the living room, Jenna stood, calmly watering a plant. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She looked up as they entered, and a small, polite smile touched her lips. It did not reach her eyes. "Hello," she said, her voice a soft, pleasant monotone. "Can I help you?" The question shattered what was left of Holly's composure. This was his wife. The woman he had loved, argued with, built a life with. He had 1,000 memories of her, or so he was told. He knew the sound of her laugh, the way she used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. He knew all these facts, but the feeling was gone. And now, standing before him, she didn't know him at all. The erasure was mutual. "Jenna," he said, his voice cracking. "It's me, Holly's." She tilted her head, a gesture of mild, academic curiosity. "I'm sorry," she said, with the same detached politeness one might use with a wrong number. "I don't believe we've met." Park put a steadying hand on his shoulder. Her presence was the only thing keeping him upright. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Park. We had a report of a suspicious vehicle in this area. Have you seen anything unusual?" Jenna considered the question for a moment. "A nice man in a white truck was here," she said. "He was collecting for a charity. I gave him a donation." "A donation," Holly's echoed, the word tasting like ash. On the small kitchen table behind her, a single cream-colored card was propped against a salt shaker. Holly's moved toward it, his legs feeling like lead. It was the calligrapher's work, his perfect mocking script. A canvas wiped, a history unmade. The brightest memory begins to fade. You chase the author, reading every sign, while the dearest chapter, once yours, is now mine. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Julian Pike hadn't just used the harvester to hurt him. He had twisted it into an act of perverse poetry. He had framed the violation as a work of art. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of Captain Cole. He filled the doorway, his face a thundercloud of fury. He took in the scene, Holly's pale and shaking, Park standing guard over him, and Jenna calmly tending to her plant, a ghost in her own home. "Crew," Cole's voice was a roar. "What have you done? I got a dozen calls. Your ex-wife's neighbors reporting a disturbance. You're suspended. You are not authorized to be here." "Captain, the killer, he did this," Park began, but Cole cut her off. "I don't want to hear it. All I see is a detective who has lost his mind harassing a civilian. This is over." He turned to a pair of uniformed officers behind him. "Take Ms. Crew down to the station. Protective custody. And get him," he jabbed a thumb at Holly's, "out of my sight. Go home, Crew. If I see you near another piece of this investigation, I will have you arrested for obstruction." They led Jenna away. She went without protest, her polite, vacant smile never wavering. She looked at Hollies as she passed, her eyes sliding over him without a flicker of recognition. The connection was severed. The last living piece of his past was gone, hollowed out and turned into a piece of the killer's art installation. He stood in the empty apartment, a stranger surrounded by the artifacts of a life he couldn't remember, belonging to a woman who no longer existed. The rage and grief were a cold, hard weight inside him. The calligrapher had taken everything. Park waited until Cole and his officers were gone. "Hollies," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We have one thing left, one name, the one that made him flinch." He looked at her, his eyes empty. "Sadie Finch," she said. "We find her now." The name was a splinter of light in the crushing darkness. It was all they had. It had to be enough. Chapter 7. The Girl Who Drew Moths. Hollies' apartment had become their command center, a grim fortress against a world that now considered him a liability. The open footlocker dominated the living room floor, its contents, the chaotic, obsessive notes of a dead man, spread across the rug. They were no longer looking for clues about the calligrapher's methods. They were hunting for a ghost named Sadie Finch. "Here," Park said, her voice sharp with discovery. She pulled a thin file from the bottom of the locker. It was labeled simply SF. Inside was a photograph of a teenage girl, maybe 17 or 18. She had dark, intense eyes, black-dyed hair, and a defiant expression. She looked like the kind of kid who found solace in the shadows. Attached to the photo was a summary. Sadie Finch, art student at the city college, part-time volunteer at the municipal archives. "The archives," Hollies murmured. "Pike's Kingdom." "It gets better," Park said, flipping a page. "Your notes from an interview you conducted with her 2 months ago. You suspected Pike was using her. She was his protégée." Hollies read the transcript of the interview. His own questions were sharp, probing. Sadie's answers were a wall of sullen denial. She admired Mr. Pike. He was the only one who understood her art. He was a genius. It was the voice of a classic indoctrination, a young, impressionable mind captured by a charismatic predator. The old Hollies had seen it, but he hadn't been able to crack her. The file contained a last known address, an apartment in the industrial district, a part of the city that was all rust-stained concrete and crumbling brick. "Let's go," Hollies said. The lethargy of his grief was burning away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The drive was silent. Park navigated the rain-slicked streets while Hollies stared out the window, the city lights painting his face in shifting patterns of red and gold. He felt Scrap's head rest on his shoulder from the back seat, a warm, living weight that anchored him to the present. Sadie Finch lived on the top floor of a warehouse that had been illegally converted into artists' lofts. The stairwell smelled of turpentine and damp plaster. They found her door, number 7B, and Park knocked, a firm, official rap. They heard shuffling inside, then the scraping of several locks being undone. The door opened a crack, held by a chain. An eye, dark and suspicious, peered out at them. "Sadie Finch?" Park asked, holding up her badge. We need to talk to you." "I already talked to a detective," the girl said, her voice brittle. "He has some follow-up questions," Park said, gesturing to Holly's. Sadie's eyes widened as she looked at Holly's. There was fear in them, but also a flicker of something else. Pity. "You look different," she said. The door closed, the chain rattled, and it opened fully. The loft was a single, cavernous room. Canvases were stacked against the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of oil paint. The artwork was disturbing. Charcoal sketches of skeletal figures, twisted landscapes, and moths. Dozens and dozens of moths, their skull-like markings rendered in obsessive detail. And on the largest easel, a half-finished portrait of a handsome, smiling man, Julian Pike. "He told me you were unwell," Sadie said, her arms wrapped around herself. "He said the job was getting to you." "He tells you a lot of things," Holly said, his voice flat. He walked around the loft, his eyes taking in the artwork. "You deliver things for him." It wasn't a question. Sadie flinched. "It's part of a project, a conceptual art piece about communication and memory." "Was delivering an envelope to Mr. Abernathy part of the project?" Park countered, her tone cutting through the girl's rehearsed lines. "The man who owned the pen shop. He's dead, Sadie." The girl's face went pale. No, he just wanted me to drop off a list of supplies he needed, that's all." "And Bethany Shaw," Holly's pressed, turning to face her. "Did you deliver her a message too?" Tears welled in Sadie's eyes. "He said it was research, a historical query. He's a good man. He's the only one who ever took me seriously." "He's a killer, Sadie," Holly said, his voice softening slightly. He recognized the shape of her manipulation. Pike hadn't broken her. He had built her up, made her feel special, made her a willing accomplice in a game she didn't understand. "He's using you, and you're in danger." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He protects me." "Does he?" Holly's asked. "Let's talk about the bloodmobile, the eraser. Did he have you follow that too?" He was guessing, taking a leap based on Pike's obsession with the van. Sadie's head snapped up. Her eyes were wide with terror. The guess had landed. "How? How did you know he called it that?" "He had you documenting its route, didn't he?" Park pushed. "Taking pictures, making notes." The girl began to tremble. "It was part of the project," she stammered. "Juxtaposing creation and decay, that's what he said. He wanted a map of the blank spaces." So that was it. Pike wasn't just happening upon the harvester's path. He was studying it, mapping it, using its victims as his own private supply of canvases. He was a predator following a larger, more indiscriminate one. "Sadie," Holly said, his voice low and urgent. "He's going to get rid of you. You're a loose end. You know too much. You have to help us." The girl's fragile composure finally shattered. She sank to the floor, sobbing, a torrent of fear and confusion pouring out of her. "I didn't know," she cried. "I swear I didn't know what he was doing." They waited for the storm to pass. When her sobs subsided into ragged breaths, she looked up, her face streaked with tears and charcoal. He told me," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "He knew you'd come back. He said you were relentless." She got to her feet and walked over to a cluttered desk. She fumbled through a pile of sketchbooks and pulled out a small, intricately folded object. He said if you ever figured it out, if you ever found me, I was supposed to give you this. She held it out to Holly's. It was a piece of cream-colored paper, the same kind the calligrapher used for his poems, folded into the shape of a perfect, delicate moth. Holly's took it from her trembling fingers. It felt weightless, and yet it carried the density of a death sentence. He could feel Pike's cold, arrogant intelligence in its perfect creases. This wasn't a clue, it was a summons. He slowly, carefully, began to unfold the origami moth, the paper crackling softly in the silent, paint-filled room. Chapter 8: The Marble Gallery. The paper moth unfolded to reveal a single, elegant sentence written in Julian Pike's flawless script. It was not a poem, it was an invitation. Tanglewood Art Museum. Midnight, the Hall of Antiquities, come and see my masterpiece. It was a trap. The thought was immediate, instinctual. A direct challenge from a man who never showed his face, who operated through proxies and shadows. It was too simple, too clean. "We are not going," Park said, her voice absolute. She stood by the window of Holly's apartment looking down at the streetlights below. "He's playing you. He'll have it rigged. A bomb, a sniper, something." "We don't have a choice," Holly's countered. He stood over the map of the city, the harvester's green path a mad scribble across its surface. "He's a dozen steps ahead of us. This is the first time he's offered us a chance to get close. It's the only move we have." "It's suicide, Holly's. We can't go to Cole. We have no backup. It'll be just the two of us." "That's how it's been all along," he said. The argument was a familiar dance of her pragmatism against his desperation. But this time his desperation had a hard, sharp edge. Jenna's hollowed-out face was seared into his mind. He had nothing left to lose. "He's a narcissist. You said it yourself, reading my old notes. Theatrical. He won't just kill me from a distance. He'll want to see my face. He'll want a monologue." Park was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and Scrap's soft breathing from the corner. "Fine," she said at last, turning from the window. "We go, but we go in smart. We go in early. We scout the place. We control the engagement." The hours leading up to midnight were a blur of tense preparation. They studied the blueprints of the Tanglewood Museum, a grand, neoclassical building of marble and glass. They planned entry points, sightlines, and escape routes. Holly's cleaned his service weapon, the familiar weight of it in his hands, one of the few things that felt real. His movements were mechanical, precise. He was a machine being wound for a single, violent purpose. They arrived at 11, parking a block away and approaching on foot through the manicured gardens that surrounded the museum. The building was a dark monolith against the night sky, its marble columns like the bones of some long-dead leviathan. A single light burned over the main entrance. "Security entrance in the back," Park whispered, her breath misting in the cool air. "Loading dock. I got the alarm codes from an old contact in property management. We have a 3-minute window." They moved like ghosts through the shadows. The alarm panel was where she said it would be. She worked quickly, her fingers flying over the keypad. A small green light blinked. They were in. The heavy steel door opened with a low groan. The inside of the museum was a world of deep shadows and unsettling silence. The air was cool and still. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floors. They moved through darkened galleries, the painted eyes of 100 portraits seeming to follow their progress. Hulking shapes of sculptures loomed in the darkness. They reached the Hall of Antiquities, a vast, two-story rotunda filled with Greek and Roman statues. The marble figures of gods and heroes stood frozen in eternal, silent drama. Moonlight streamed in through a huge domed skylight, bathing the room in a spectral, silver glow. In the exact center of the room, on a black pedestal, sat a single object covered by a red velvet cloth, the masterpiece. Too obvious, Hollis breathed. He scanned the upper balcony that circled the rotunda. The shadows were deep up there, a perfect place for an observer. You take the balcony, I'll approach it. No, Park said, her hand on his arm. We stay together. Before he could argue, a sound echoed through the hall, a series of loud metallic clicks. Floodlights, positioned around the balcony, snapped on one by one, filling the rotunda with a brilliant, unforgiving light. The statues threw long, distorted shadows. Hollis and Park were caught in the open, exposed. And they were not alone. From behind the marble columns, figures emerged. Not one, not two, but a dozen. They wore the dark blue uniforms of the city police, and leading them, his face set in a grim, triumphant mask, was Captain Marcus Cole. "Drop your weapons, crew," Cole's voice boomed, echoing off the marble. "It's over." Hollis and Park stood frozen, their guns half raised. They were surrounded. There was no escape. It was a setup, a perfect, elegant trap. Pike had never intended to meet them at all. "Captain, listen to me," Park began, her voice steady despite the circle of guns aimed at them. "We were lured here. The calligrapher—" "I know all about your calligrapher," Cole sneered. "I got an anonymous tip, an obsessed, suspended detective meeting his accomplice, planting evidence to throw us off his trail." He looked at Hollis, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I never thought you'd break this badly, crew. I really didn't." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Sadie Finch. After they had left, the terrified girl must have called her mentor. And Pike, ever the opportunist, had used her fear to orchestrate this final, brilliant checkmate. He hadn't just defeated Hollis. He had used the entire police department as his weapon. "You've got it all wrong," Hollis said, his voice quiet. But it was useless. The narrative was set. He was the mad detective who had finally gone over the edge. "On your knees, hands behind your head," an officer commanded. Slowly, Hollis and Park complied, lowering themselves to the cold marble floor. As the officers moved in, Hollis looked up at the balcony, at the deep shadows between the floodlights. For a single, fleeting moment, he saw him. A tall, well-dressed figure looking down on the scene. A spectator in the front row of his own theatrical production. Julian Pike allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, then melted back into the darkness. The cold metal of handcuffs closed around Hollis's wrists. The click echoed in the silent marble gallery. The game was over. The artist had framed his critic. Chapter 9: The Stillness of the Cage. The interrogation room was a sterile white box designed to strip away everything but the truth. There were no windows, no clocks, just a metal table, 3 chairs, and the humming silence of the building. The contrast with the grand, marble-filled museum was jarring. Holly's had gone from a hunter in a grand arena to a specimen in a jar. He sat at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him. Across from him, Captain Cole nursed a cup of coffee, his expression one of weary disappointment. "Let's walk through it, Hollies," Cole began, his voice devoid of its usual anger replaced by a clinical calm that was somehow more unnerving. The secret files, the illegal surveillance of a minor, breaking into a crime scene, and now breaking into the museum. It's a pattern of obsession. You couldn't catch him, so you became him. Holly said nothing. The accusation was absurd, but his reality was equally so. How could he explain? A poetic serial killer who worships memory is using a supernatural memory vampire to create blank canvases for his art, and he framed me. He would sound like a lunatic. The truth was his worst possible defense. "Look at this from my side," Cole continued, leaning forward. "The killer starts quoting your private case notes after you claim to have amnesia. You start breaking protocol, acting erratically. Then your ex-wife is assaulted, right after you've had a public confrontation with her. It looks bad, Hollies. It looks like you're spiraling, trying to create a narrative where you're still the hero." Every word was a brick in the wall being built around him. He could see the logic in it, the clean, simple explanation that avoided all the impossible truths. It was the story of a good cop gone bad, a story everyone could understand. "It wasn't me," Holly said, his voice a dead monotone. "Then who was it?" Cole challenged. "Give me something real, not ghost stories about blood trucks." Holly's was silent. He had nothing real. His reality had been stolen, and what was left was unbelievable. In another white room down the hall, Park faced 2 stone-faced detectives from Internal Affairs. Her badge and weapon sat on the table between them. "Officer Park," the older detective said, "you have a stellar record, a real rising star. Don't throw it all away for him." "Detective Crew is the best cop I've ever known," Park said, her voice unshakable. "He is being manipulated by a highly intelligent psychopath." "Or you're being manipulated by a desperate partner," the other detective countered. "You aided a suspended officer. You withheld information. You were present during a break-in. At best, your career is over. At worst, you're looking at charges as an accessory." "I have evidence," Park said, her gaze steady. "The tech division has data. A ghost signal originating from the records office during the killer's only phone call. Traffic cam analysis that places a specific, unregistered vehicle near every victim's location. Forensic analysis of the ink." She laid out the facts, the pieces of data that Finn had painstakingly collected. She knew it wasn't enough to prove Hollies' innocence, but it was enough to muddy the waters, to poke holes in Cole's neat and tidy narrative. She could see a flicker of doubt in the older detective's eyes. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. They moved Hollies from the interrogation room to a central holding cell. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. He was just another piece of human refuse now, processed by the system he had once served. He sat on a cold metal bench, The sounds of the cell block a low, miserable symphony of coughs, mutters, and distant shouts. They brought in a new detainee, a man picked up for vagrancy. He was thin, his clothes ragged, but his face was oddly calm. His eyes were unfocused, his expression one of distant serenity. He sat down on the bench opposite Holly's and began to hum softly to himself. Holly's recognized the look instantly. It was the same placid emptiness he had seen in Jenna's eyes. This man was a hollow. He watched the man. There was no misery in him, no fear, no anger, just a profound and unnerving stillness. He wasn't suffering, he was simply absent. The horror, Hollies realized, was not for the hollows themselves. They were at peace. The horror was for the people who were left behind, the ones who had to look at the empty shells of their loved ones and remember what used to be inside. Julian Pike had called it a blank canvas. He hadn't just been speaking metaphorically. He was talking about this state, this absolute peace that came from absolute emptiness. It was a twisted kind of mercy, a philosophical endgame. The thought was chilling. Hours later, an officer came to the cell. "Crew, you're being transferred, county lockup." They cuffed him again and led him through the precinct. He saw Park standing by the exit, talking with a man in a suit he didn't recognize. She met his eyes as he passed. Her expression was grim, but she gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a promise of rescue. It was a promise to keep fighting. As they pushed him into the back of the transport van, he closed his eyes. He was at his absolute lowest point. He had no memory, no career, no allies left on the outside except one. His ex-wife was a ghost, and the man who had destroyed his life was free, his victory complete. He tried to retreat into the emptiness of his own mind, to find the same peace as the hollow in the cell. But something pushed back. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a memory. It was an image, appearing in the darkness behind his eyelids with the sudden clarity of a lightning flash. A bright red door. A spiral staircase seen from below. The smell of dust and decaying paper. It was a fragment, untethered to any context, but it was his. It felt like his. It was the first piece of his past that had surfaced on its own, a shard of the man he used to be, pushing up through the suffocating void. It was a crack in the wall of his prison. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chapter 10: The Door and the Foundation. The image of the red door became Holly's rosary. He held onto it through the dehumanizing process of being booked into county jail, through the long, disorienting hours in a holding cell. The red door, the spiral staircase. He repeated the details to himself, a mantra against the encroaching emptiness. It was the only piece of his own mind he had left. He was granted one phone call. He dialed the only number he knew by heart because Park had made him memorize it. "Park," he said when she answered. "Hollies, are you okay?" Her voice was a lifeline. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I have something, a red door, a spiral staircase. It feels important, like a memory trying to surface." He heard the sound of a keyboard clicking on her end. "A red door," she repeated. "Tell me everything you see." He described the image, the dust motes in the air, the angle of the view from below the stairs, the specific shade of faded crimson on the door. He gave her the raw data of his vision. "I'm on it," she said. "I've been going through your footlocker again, page by page. If it's in there, I'll find it." The line went dead. 2 days passed. It was an eternity of gray walls, gray food, and the hollowed-out faces of other inmates. Hollis kept to himself, hoarding the image of the red door like a secret treasure. He was on the verge of losing hope when he was called to the visitor's room. Park sat on the other side of the thick plexiglass. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright with a fierce, triumphant energy. She held up a piece of paper to the glass. It was a page from his secret file, a profile of Julian Pike. Her finger was pointing to a single, scribbled annotation. Pike Julian, B. 1978, childhood home, 121 Elm Street, demolished 1998. Site of suspected familial trauma, murder-suicide of parents. Records indicate a distinctive red door. "You found it," Hollis breathed. "You found it, Hollis," she corrected him. "Your old self was digging into his past, trying to find the source of his obsession. The red door was the key." "But the house is gone," he said, the flicker of hope dimming. "The house is," she said, a grim smile touching her lips. "But the foundation isn't. And you know what was built on top of that property in 2002, the new wing of the municipal archives." The archives, Pike's kingdom. His workplace, his hunting ground, and his home. It was all connected. "There's more," Park continued, her voice dropping. "I pulled the original building plans for Pike's old house and the plans for the new archive wing. The old house had a sub-basement, a cold storage room. When they built the new wing, they filled in most of the old foundation, but the plans show that this sub-basement wasn't filled. It was sealed off, and its location corresponds to a disused storage area in the deepest level of the archives. He had built his lair on the bones of his own traumatic past. The theatricality, the narcissism, it all clicked into place. "I need to get out of here," Hollis said. "That's the problem," Park admitted. "My testimony only got you a formal review. Cole has you buried under so much red tape it will take weeks to get a hearing. We don't have weeks." That night, during the prisoner transfer from the courthouse back to the jail, the transport van stalled in the middle of a bridge. The engine sputtered and died. The two guards got out, cursing, and opened the hood. A moment later, a city maintenance truck pulled up behind them. The driver, a woman in overalls and a baseball cap, got out. It was Una Park. The rest was a blur of calculated chaos. A whispered word, a conveniently dropped set of keys, a moment of distraction. Hollis slipped out the back of the van and into the maintenance truck. They were gone before the guards even realized their prisoner was missing. He was officially a fugitive now. There was no going back. They drove to the archives. The city lights a smear of neon against the dark sky. Park had a set of master keys, a crowbar, and 2 flashlights. They entered the silent, cavernous building through a service entrance. They navigated the maze of shelves in the lower levels, the smell of old paper thick in the air. They found the door marked "Disused Storage." It was blocked by a heavy metal shelving unit. It took their combined strength to move it, the metal screeching in protest in the silent building. Behind it was a wall of newer drywall, but at the bottom, near the floor, Holly saw the outline of older, rougher stonework. The old foundation. "Here," he said, and went to work with the crowbar. The drywall came away in dusty chunks, revealing a solid brick wall. But it wasn't solid. One section was different, the mortar newer. He worked the crowbar into a seam and pulled. A section of the brickwork swung inward with a groan of rusty hinges. It was a hidden door. They stepped through, their flashlight beams cutting through decades of darkness. They were in a small, stone-walled room, and at the far end of it was a door. It was made of heavy wood, its paint faded and peeling, but it was unmistakably, vividly red. Hollis approached it, his heart pounding. This was it, the source. He pushed it open. They had found Julian Pike's sanctuary. It was a museum of murder. Personal items from each victim were displayed on pedestals, lit by small, battery-powered spotlights. Bethany Shaw's reading glasses, Mr. Abernathy's favorite fountain pen, and on a central pedestal, a single, framed photograph of a young, smiling Jenna Crew taken years ago. The walls were covered in Julian's journals, pages and pages of his elegant script, detailing his philosophy, his art, his obsession. He wrote about finding the harvester, about seeing its work and recognizing a kindred form of art, the art of oblivion. He had not created the harvester. He had simply become its high priest, its curator. As they stood in the center of this monument to madness, a sound reached them, a low, resonant hum. It was the sound of the Bloodmobile's machine, but deeper, louder. It was coming from a large ventilation shaft in the ceiling of the room. Then a voice from the red doorway behind them. It was calm, amused, and terrifyingly close. "I knew you would appreciate this place, Detective. It took you long enough to find it." Julian Pike stood there, silhouetted against the light from the archive corridor. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding a strange glass canister. Inside it, a faint, silvery light swirled like captured smoke. "A gift," Pike said, his lips curling into a smile. "The memory of the last case you solved before you lost yourself. I thought you might want it back." He was holding a piece of Hollis's mind hostage. The final, intimate confrontation had begun. Chapter 11. The Curator and the Void. Julian Pike stood in the red doorway, a portrait of calm, intellectual triumph. He held the glass canister with the reverence a priest might hold a holy relic. The silvery, captive light within pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Behind him, the mundane light of the archive corridor seemed a world away from this hidden chapel of obsession. Park had her weapon trained on his chest, a solid, unwavering point of black steel in the tense air. Holly stood frozen, not by fear, but by a profound sense of dislocation. He was an actor who had stumbled onto the wrong stage, handed a script he couldn't read. "Please, officer, lower your weapon," Pike said, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone. He took a step into the room, his eyes fixed on Holly's. "This is not a moment for crude violence. This is a moment of revelation, of art." "You murdered 5 people," Park said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. She did not lower her gun. "I immortalized them," Pike corrected gently. He began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the room, his movements like those of a museum curator leading a private tour. He gestured to a small, silver locket on a velvet pedestal. Bethany Shaw. She spent her life preserving the stories of others. Now, her own story, her final, perfect moment of quiet contemplation, is preserved for eternity. Is that not a beautiful symmetry? He moved to the next exhibit, Mr. Abernathy's fountain pen. He dedicated his life to the tools of memory. I used his own ink, the very formula he helped me perfect, to write his epitaph. He became a part of his own life's work, a final, masterful signature. He was not confessing, he was boasting. Each murder was a brushstroke in a grand composition, and this room was his gallery. Hollies watched him, a strange detachment settling over him. He felt no rage, no grief for these victims. He felt only a cold, analytical curiosity. He was a blank slate, and Pike was trying to write on him. "And her," Pike said, his voice softening as he came to a stop before the photograph of Jenna. "She was a special case, a study in potential energy. All that history, all that shared emotion between the two of you. A rich, vibrant tapestry, and now," he smiled, "a perfect, clean, white canvas. My gift to you, detective, a fresh start." The humming from the ventilation shaft in the ceiling seemed to grow louder, a resonant bass note underscoring Pike's lecture. It was a sound that vibrated deep in Hollies' bones. "What is that?" Park demanded, her eyes flicking up toward the vent. "That," Pike said with a sigh of deep satisfaction, "is the other artist, my silent partner, the great eraser." He turned his full attention back to Hollies. "I've studied it for years. It is a magnificent, terrible thing, a force of nature like a hurricane or a plague. It consumes the very thing I hold most sacred. It creates the void, and I in turn give that void meaning. I am the curator of its oblivion." He held up the glass canister. The light inside swirled more quickly now, as if agitated by the proximity of the hum. "I followed you, detective. I knew the harvester was near your apartment the day your incident occurred. I was close enough to capture this." He held the canister out to Hollies. "The psychic residue, the echo of what was taken. Specifically, the memory of the moment you solved my first puzzle, the moment you understood my genius. It's all in there, a perfect, distilled piece of your own mind." He set the canister down on the central pedestal, an offering. "I have a final composition in mind, detective, a masterpiece, and you are the central figure, but it requires your participation. It requires you to understand. I am offering you a key to your own mind, a chance to be my critic once more. All you have to do is prove you are still worthy." While Pike was absorbed in his performance, Park had been subtly shifting her position. She was a creature of tactics, not theater. She saw the room not as a gallery but as a tactical problem. One entrance, one obsessed, monologuing killer, one unknown variable in the ceiling. She saw a heavy marble bust of some forgotten Roman emperor on a pedestal near the wall. An opportunity. Hollies ignored the canister. The promise of his own past held no allure. He was more interested in the machine. "You don't control it," he stated. It wasn't a question. Pike's smile faltered for a second. "Control is a vulgar concept. I am a collaborator, a student. I observe its patterns, I map its feeding grounds. I anticipate the blank spaces it will create, and I prepare my installations accordingly. You used Sadie Finch to map it for you, Holly said, the fragment of knowledge from their interview surfacing. The girl was a useful apprentice, Pike conceded, devoted, but ultimately her work is done. The casual dismissal, the finality in his tone, sent a chill through Holly's. The girl was a loose end, a piece to be discarded. It was the opening Park needed. With a sudden, explosive movement, she shoved the heavy marble bust off its pedestal. It crashed to the floor with a sound like a thunderclap, the stone head shattering into a dozen white fragments. The moment of distraction was all she needed. She lunged, not at Pike, but toward the red door, trying to cut off his only escape route. Pike reacted with surprising speed. He was not a fighter, but he was a creature of contingencies. He didn't move toward Park. He snatched the canister from the pedestal and lunged toward Holly's, a small black object appearing in his other hand, a taser. He was not trying to escape. He was trying to finish his masterpiece. The fight was a clumsy, brutal thing in the cluttered room. Holly's met Pike's lunge, his body moving with an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He knocked the taser from Pike's hand, the weapon skittering across the floor. They grappled, crashing against a display case, sending antique pens scattering like spilled matchsticks. Park, seeing the fight engaged, changed her vector and charged toward them. In the chaos, the glass canister flew from Pike's grasp. It spun through the air in a slow, beautiful arc, the silver light within it pulsing frantically. It hit the stone floor. It did not shatter, but a long, hairline crack appeared on its surface. A wisp of the silver light, like smoke, escaped from the crack. The humming from the vent stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, a high-pitched, harmonic shriek. The metal grill on the vent began to vibrate violently, the screws holding it in place groaning under some immense, unseen pressure. The room grew cold. The game was over. The other artist had arrived. Chapter 12. The Hunger from the Walls. The silver light that bled from the cracked canister did not dissipate. It hung in the air like a shred of mist, coalescing into a shimmering, ethereal tendril. It seemed to taste the air for a moment, then it shot across the room with unnatural speed, not toward Pike or Park, but directly toward Holly's. It struck him in the chest. It did not feel like a physical impact. It was an invasion. A billion volts of pure information surged into the emptiness of his mind. He saw a rain-swept street from a perspective he almost recognized. He smelled old paper and iron-gall ink. He felt a jolt of triumphant discovery, the click of puzzle pieces falling into place in a mind that was sharp, whole, and brilliantly alive. He saw Julian Pike's face, not as a killer, but as a suspect in a photograph, his smile holding a secret only the old Hollies could decipher. The memory, the one Pike had stolen, was trying to force its way back in. It was not a clean restoration. It was a psychic demolition. His knees buckled. He cried out, a raw, agonized sound, and collapsed to the floor. His body convulsed as the alien data of his own past ripped through his neural pathways. It was too much, too fast. He was a man dying of thirst, being drowned in an ocean. The shriek from the vent intensified, a sound that vibrated in their teeth. The heavy metal grill began to bow inward, the metal groaning as if a great weight were being pressed against it from the other side. A thick, black, oily substance, iridescent like a slick of oil on water, began to ooze from the seams. The memory fungus. It was growing with terrifying speed, coating the ceiling around the vent. Pike had scrambled back to his feet. He was no longer the calm, arrogant curator. His face was alight with a mixture of terror and ecstatic, scientific rapture. He fumbled in his coat, pulling out a small digital recorder. "A direct feeding response," he whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "Provoked by a psychic energy release. The symbiotic relationship is even more complex than I theorized." He aimed the recorder at the ceiling, a mad naturalist documenting the arrival of a hurricane. Park ignored him. She was on her knees beside Holly's, trying to shake him back to consciousness. "Holly's, Holly's, fight it." His eyes were rolled back in his head, his body rigid, caught in the throes of the psychic seizure. With a final, deafening screech, the bolts holding the vent cover sheared off. The heavy grill was ripped inward into the darkness of the shaft, as if plucked by a giant, invisible hand. For a moment there was only a black, yawning hole in the ceiling, dripping with the oily fungus. Then something dropped from it. It landed on the floor with a soft, boneless thud. It was Vernon, but it was not the folksy, gentle driver. His cardigan was torn, his skin was pale as tallow, and his eyes were gone. In their place were two pools of absolute liquid blackness. He rose to his feet with an unnatural fluidity, his limbs moving without the constraints of a normal human skeleton. He was a marionette, and the strings led up into the darkness of the shaft. He ignored Pike, who was babbling into his recorder. He ignored Park, who now had her weapon trained on him. His head tilted, a series of soft, cracking sounds coming from his neck. His attention was fixed on the convulsing form of Holly's crew and the shimmering remnants of the spilled memory still hanging in the air. He was a janitor, arrived to clean up a mess. "Get away from him," Park yelled. Vernon took a silent, gliding step toward her. She fired. The first shot hit him square in the chest. It made a sound like a fist punching a side of beef. A dark, viscous fluid, not blood, seeped from the hole. He did not slow. The second shot hit his shoulder. He barely seemed to notice. The soulless black eyes remained fixed on his objective. Pike watched, mesmerized. Incredible. The drone body has no pain receptors. It's a purely functional vessel, a biological machine. Park knew she could not stop him. She had to move Holly's. She grabbed her partner under the arms, trying to drag his dead weight away from the creature. It was like trying to move a statue. From the shadows near the entrance, a low growl echoed. "Scrap." The dog had followed them in, silent and unnoticed in the chaos. He had been cowering by the door, but seeing his master threatened by this new, silent monster, his terror was overcome by a primal loyalty. He shot across the room, a blur of mangy fur and bared teeth, and launched himself at Vernon's leg. Vernon did not look down. His attention remained on Holly's, but his hand, moving with an impossible whip-like speed, descended. It caught Scrap in the side and tossed the dog through the air. Scrap hit the far wall with a sickening crack and a pained yelp, then fell to the floor, limp and unmoving. The sight of his dog, his one constant, loyal companion, being so casually and brutally dispatched, pierced through the psychic storm in Holly's mind. For a single, lucid second the convulsing stopped. His eyes focused. He saw Park, terrified but defiant, standing over him. He saw Pike, a rapturous observer of the horror. And he saw the thing that wore Vernon's body, its black eyes promising an unspeakable emptiness, as it reached a pale, steady hand down toward his face. Chapter 13. Symbiont and Sacrifice. The lucid moment was a pinprick of light in a hurricane of chaos. Holly's mind was still a battlefield, memories and sensations warring for dominance, but the image of Scrap lying broken against the wall was a clear, sharp focal point of rage. The creature in Vernon's skin loomed over him, its hand descending, the black, depthless eyes promising a final, silent oblivion. Park fired again, this time aiming for the head. The shot struck Vernon's cheek, tearing away a flap of pale flesh. There was no bone or muscle beneath, only a strange, fibrous, pulsing white material. Vernon's head snapped to the side from the impact, but then slowly, deliberately it turned back, the black eyes refocusing on her. The drone was damaged but not disabled. "It's not alive in any traditional sense, officer," Pike narrated from the sidelines, his voice a manic whisper into his recorder. "The consciousness, the entity itself, is likely in the shaft. This is merely a remote appendage, a tool." He was a child on Christmas morning, unwrapping the most grotesque, wonderful toy he could have imagined. The simple, physical grounding of the dog's sacrifice had given Holly's an anchor. He could feel the cold stone of the floor beneath him. He could feel the ragged tear of his own breathing. He had to move. He had to fight. He scrambled backward, away from Vernon's descending hand, his limbs clumsy and uncoordinated. Park, seeing him move, laid down another 2 shots at the drone's center of mass, using the fire to cover his retreat. The bullets punched into the creature, slowing it, making its movements momentarily jerky, but it kept coming, a relentless, implacable machine. Pike, seeing his precious specimen being damaged, finally reacted. "Stop it!" he shrieked, no longer the detached observer. "You're destroying the data." He made a move not to help but to protect his discovery. The room was a triangle of desperate action. Vernon advanced on Park. Park fired and retreated, trying to draw the creature away from Holly's. And Holly's, his mind still flickering with the violent ghosts of his past, pushed himself to his feet. He saw 2 threats. The immediate physical one was the silent, black-eyed drone. The other, the true monster, was Pike, the man who saw all this horror as a form of entertainment. Pike was edging toward the red door, trying to slip away in the chaos, his precious recorder held tight in his hand. If he escaped, this would never end. He would find another victim, another canvas, another masterpiece to compose. In that fractured moment, Holly's body made a choice for him. It was a choice born from the instincts of the detective he used to be. The immediate threat could be contained. The architect of the pain had to be stopped. He ignored Vernon. He ignored Park's shouts. He launched himself across the room, tackling Julian Pike just as the curator reached the threshold of the red door. They crashed through the doorway together, tumbling out into the dimly lit corridor of the archives, a tangle of limbs and fury. They landed hard on the concrete floor, Pike's recorder skittering away into the shadows. Back in the secret room, Park was alone. She had backed herself against the far wall, her clip empty. The drone, Vernon, stopped its advance. With Hollies and Pike gone, its primary objective had changed. It stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, and tilted its head up toward the gaping, dripping maw of the ventilation shaft. A new horror began. A thin, ethereal tendril of the same silvery light that had come from the canister descended from the shaft. It was not violent or fast. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, connecting with the top of Vernon's head. The drone's body shuddered once. The dark fluid from its bullet wound stopped leaking. The damage was being repaired. The machine was being serviced. Park stared, frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. This was the true nature of the creature. Not just a mindless eater, but a complex biological system capable of maintenance, of direction. A soft whimper came from the corner of the room. Scrap. The dog was alive. It was struggling to its feet, its back leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It let out another low, pained whine, a sound of pure misery and loyalty. The sound broke Park's paralysis. She couldn't fight the creature, but she could save the last, living pieces of her partner's world. She scooped up the injured dog, ignoring its yelp of pain, and scrambled for the door. She had to get to Holly's. She had to get them out. She burst into the corridor to find Holly's and Pike locked in a primitive, desperate struggle. Holly's was on top, his hands locked around Pike's throat, his face a mask of cold, empty fury. Pike was clawing at his face, his academic detachment stripped away to reveal a panicked, feral animal beneath. "Hollies, stop," Park yelled. "You'll kill him." Hollies didn't seem to hear her. He was lost, running on a script written by a man he no longer was. From the room behind her, a new sound began. The cheerful, folksy, tuneless humming she had heard once before from a recording. The sound of Vernon, the gentle blood drive attendant. The drone's repairs were complete. It was coming. Chapter 14. The Price of a Past. The sound of Vernon's cheerful humming was a more profound threat than any monstrous shriek. It was the sound of the mask being put back on, the horror returning to its hiding place in the mundane. It was the sound of the janitor finishing his work and preparing to walk unnoticed among the living once more. The sound galvanized Park into action. "Hollies now," she screamed, her voice echoing in the long archive corridor. "We have to seal it in." Her words, the sheer urgency in her tone, finally broke through his fugue state. He looked down at Pike, at the man's terrified, bulging eyes, and his hands loosened. He wasn't a killer. He was a cop. The returning memory, fractured as it was, reminded him of that one essential fact. He shoved himself off Pike, leaving the curator gasping for air on the concrete floor. He stumbled back toward the hidden entrance to the secret room. Park was already there, pulling at the heavy, disguised brick door. "Help me," she grunted. Together, they swung the heavy door shut. The humming from inside was cut off abruptly. There was a solid, final thud as the door settled into its frame. "It won't hold," Hollies said. his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It doesn't have to," Park replied. "Not for long." They scrambled to the heavy metal shelving unit they had moved to get in. With adrenaline-fueled strength, they pushed it back into place, its metal feet screeching in protest against the floor. They wedged it hard against the wall, a crude but effective barricade. A soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump began on the other side of the wall. It wasn't a violent assault. It was the sound of patient, methodical work. Vernon was testing the door, looking for a way out. They turned their attention back to Pike. He was pushing himself up, a thin trickle of blood running from his lip. He saw them, saw the barricaded wall, and a look of pure, animalistic panic crossed his face. His sanctuary was now his prison cell, shared with the very force of nature he had worshipped from a safe distance. "You can't leave me here with that thing," he pleaded, his voice a raw, terrified squawk. "Open the door. It will erase me." The irony was lost on him. The man who curated oblivion was now terrified of becoming part of the collection. "You should have thought of that before you started your masterpiece," Park said, her voice dripping with ice. The distant wail of sirens grew louder. Someone, somewhere in the vast, silent building, had tripped a silent alarm. The police were coming. Cole was coming. "They'll find him," Hollis said. "And they'll find his gallery. It's over." "For him," Park said, looking at Hollis. "But for us it's just started. We're fugitives. We assaulted an officer. We were here. They'll never believe the truth." She was right. The scene was damning. They would be caught in the crossfire, their unbelievable story buried under a mountain of circumstantial evidence. "This way," she said, grabbing his arm. She picked up Scrap, who was whimpering softly, cradling the dog like a child. "There's a sub-level storm drain access 2 corridors down. It'll get us out to the canal." They left Pike pleading at the barricade, his frantic pleas echoing behind them as the sound of the sirens grew to a deafening roar. They ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the archive, a desperate flight into an uncertain future. They found the access hatch, a rusted iron circle in the floor. Park wrenched it open. The smell of damp earth and stagnant water billowed up. They descended into the darkness, pulling the heavy cover closed above them, plunging their world into an absolute, suffocating blackness just as they heard the heavy thud of police boots in the corridor above. They were free, but they were also entombed. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Hollis leaned against the cold, curved wall of the storm drain, the chaotic fragments of his memory swirling in his head. He remembered the case now. He remembered the clues, the intellectual chase, the face of the killer. He had the facts, the data points of his former life as a detective, but the feelings were still absent. He remembered loving Jenna, but he could not feel the love. He remembered the thrill of the hunt, but he could not feel the excitement. He was a perfectly reconstructed library of books with blank pages. He looked at Park, her determined face barely visible in the faint light from a distant sewer grate. He looked at the injured dog in her arms. These were the only 2 things in the world that felt real. The price of getting his past back was the realization of how much of it was still truly gone. The harvester hadn't just taken his memories, it had taken the man who made them. From the other side of their makeshift barricade in the archives, the soft, patient thumping stopped. Julian Pike, holding his breath in terror, pressed his ear to the cold brick. He heard nothing. A minute passed. Two. Maybe the creature had gone dormant. Maybe it had another way out. Then a new sound began. The gentle, folksy, cheerful humming of Vernon, and the soft, scraping sound of a single, patient finger tracing the mortar lines of the brick door, testing for the weakest point. The curator was now officially part of the exhibition. Chapter 15. The Harvester's Shadow. The safe house was a ghost. It was an apartment belonging to an old informant of Park's, a man who had died 2 years prior but whose lease she had secretly kept paying for just such an emergency. It was a time capsule of the 1990s, smelling of dust and stale cigarette smoke. It was anonymous. It was perfect. Park gently laid Scrap on a threadbare sofa. The dog whimpered as she examined his leg. It was broken, but it was a clean break. She fashioned a crude splint from a wooden ruler and strips of a bedsheet, her movements efficient and gentle. Hollis watched her, a spectator in his own life. He sat at the small kitchen table, staring at his own hands. He flexed his fingers. These hands had held Jenna's. They had written the brilliant notes in the footlocker. They had nearly choked the life out of Julian Pike. They were his hands, but they felt like borrowed tools. The memory it's like a file I downloaded, he tried to explain, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. I can access the data. Pike, Sadie Finch, the ink, the moths. I know he killed those people. I know how I figured it out. But it's all third person. I'm watching a movie of a detective I used to know. Give it time, Park said, not looking up from her work on the dog's leg. The mind needs to heal. The harvester doesn't heal, he countered. It amputates. This is all I get back, the scar tissue. He looked up at her. What it did to Jenna, is that permanent? Park finished tying the splint and straightened up, her face grim. The hollows we've tracked, they don't recover, they live out their routines. They're not unhappy, they're just not there. The finality of it was a cold, hard weight. He had not saved her. He had merely avenged her. The distinction was a universe of failure. They spent the next day in the apartment, watching the news on an old television. The story of the Tanglewood Museum standoff had been replaced by a new, more sensational one. A major incident at the municipal archives. A decorated police captain, Marcus Cole, had led a raid that resulted in the capture of the notorious serial killer, the calligrapher. The suspect, a reclusive archivist named Julian Pike, was found in a catatonic state in a sealed-off portion of the sub-basement, suffering from what doctors were calling a complete psychotic breakdown. There was no mention of a second person in the room, no mention of a creature, no mention of Vernon. The official narrative was clean, simple, and airtight. They found him, Hollis said, but he's a hollow. Vernon got to him, Park stated. The perfect ending. Pike wanted to curate oblivion, and now he's a permanent part of the exhibition. She switched off the television. They also found his gallery, the evidence from the victims. The case is closed. You're exonerated. But we're still fugitives, he pointed out. I escaped custody. You aided and abetted. Details, she said with a weary wave of her hand. The real problem is that the monster is still out there. Pike was a sideshow, a deranged fanboy. The real killer, the one that's taken hundreds of lives or parts of them, is still driving its route. He knew she was right. His personal nightmare was over, but the city's silent plague continued. His new, cold, logical mind saw the problem with absolute clarity. The machine had to be stopped. His motivation was no longer about reclaiming his past. It was about preventing this from happening to anyone else. It was the only mission that made sense. "So what's our move?" he asked. "We have no resources, no authority. The entire department is looking for us." Park's phone, a cheap burner she had bought on the way to the safe house, buzzed. She looked at the screen. A single encrypted message. "We have one resource left," she said, a small, fierce smile on her face. "Finn." The message contained a single image. It was a map of the city. Finn had continued his work, tracking the movements of the harvester. In the 2 days since the incident at the archives, the van's route was no longer the chaotic, city-spanning scribble it had been before. It was now a slow, deliberate spiral. Dozens of data points circled the outer neighborhoods, gradually tightening, moving inward toward the city center. It was a predator circling its prey. Or perhaps it was a creature returning to its nest. At the absolute center of the spiral, Finn had placed a single, flashing red marker. "What is that?" Hollis asked, leaning over her shoulder to look at the map. "The old Central Power substation," Park said, her voice a whisper. "It was the first electrical building in the city, built in the 1890s. Most of it is decommissioned now, but it still houses the primary transformer junctions for the entire downtown grid. It's a place of immense, concentrated energy." They looked at each other, the same terrifying conclusion dawning on them both. The creature, the harvester, had been wounded or disturbed by their confrontation with Pike. It had lost a drone, and now it was retreating. It was heading home, to feed, to heal, to nest. The hunt was not over. They had just found the monster's lair. Chapter 16. The Concrete Veins. The old power substation was a brick-and-steel cathedral of the industrial age. It squatted in the city's forgotten heart, a district of abandoned warehouses and rust-streaked rail yards. Its towering smokestacks, silent for decades, clawed at the perpetually gray sky like skeletal fingers. The air around it was heavy and still, thick with the smell of ozone and damp, old concrete. A low, almost subsonic hum emanated from its walls, a deep thrumming that resonated in the chest and made the teeth ache. Hollis and Park observed it from the rooftop of a derelict textile factory across the street. The night was cold and moonless. They had spent the last 24 hours planning, scavenging, and preparing. Their resources were meager. Park's sidearm with 2 spare clips, a high-powered flashlight, a crowbar, and a duffel bag filled with gear Finn had liberated from a police impound lot, flares, a bolt cutter, and a length of climbing rope. Scrap, his splinted leg holding, was with them, a silent, 3-legged sentinel at Park's side. "There," Hollis said, pointing. The Harvester bloodmobile was parked in a recessed loading bay, almost perfectly hidden from the street. It was dark and inert, It looked less like a vehicle and more like the shed carapace of some huge insect. There was no sign of vermin or whatever wore his skin now. Finn's analysis was right, Park murmured, her breath fogging in the cold. He tracked the van's energy signature. It's not drawing power from its own engine anymore. It's plugged in. It's physically connected to the substation's grid. The creature wasn't just hiding here. It had integrated itself. It had sunk its roots into the city's power source, its very circulatory system. "How do we get in?" Hollis asked, his gaze sweeping the substation's formidable brick facade. The windows were boarded, the doors heavy, rusted steel. "We don't go through the walls," Park said, unfolding a frayed blueprint of the substation, another gift from Finn's digital back alleys. "We go under. The substation is connected to the city's old steam tunnel network. There's a maintenance access point 2 blocks from here." The steam tunnels were a claustrophobic's nightmare. A maze of narrow, brick-lined passages filled with a century of dust, cobwebs, and the ghosts of forgotten laborers. The air was hot and thick, smelling of rust and boiled minerals. Their flashlight beams cut sharp, dancing cones through the oppressive darkness. Huge insulated pipes lined the walls, hissing and gurgling with a life of their own. Scrap limped between them, whining softly, his senses overwhelmed by the strange, subterranean world. They followed the blueprint's path, their progress slow and tense. The low hum they'd felt on the surface was more pronounced down here, a constant physical pressure against their bodies. It was the building's heartbeat, or the creature's. "It's like the whole building is the machine now," Hollis whispered, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast, dark network. He could feel the cold logic of his restored memories trying to piece it together. The harvester wasn't a monster that drove a truck. The truck was just a limb, a mobile feeding appendage. The true creature, the central consciousness, was something else entirely. Something vast, ancient, and stationary. Something that had found a perfect, symbiotic home in the city's electrical guts. They found the access point indicated on the map, a rusted iron ladder leading up to a grated ceiling. The hum was loudest here, a deep, resonant thrum that made the rungs of the ladder vibrate under their hands. Park went first. She used the bolt cutters on a heavy padlock, the snap of the metal shockingly loud in the hissing silence. She pushed the heavy grate open and climbed out. Hollis handed Scrap up to her, the dog struggling and whimpering in fear. Then he followed. They emerged into the substation's ground floor. It was a cavernous space, a forest of colossal, humming transformers and monolithic switchgear cabinets. A network of thick, black cables, as thick as a man's arm, snaked across the floor and up the walls, all converging on a central point in the heart of the building. But these were not standard power cables. They were pulsing with a faint, internal, bioluminescent light. They looked less like wires and more like veins. And they were all covered in the same slick, iridescent black memory fungus they had seen in Pike's hidden room. It carpeted the floor, coated the machinery, and hung from the ceiling in thick, dripping festoons. They had not entered a building. They had entered the digestive tract of a god. The veins all led to the center of the room, to a massive, circular pit that descended into the building's sub-basement. A faint, Silvery light emanated from the depths of the pit, pulsing in time with the deep, resonant hum. This was the creature's heart, its nest. As they crept closer to the edge of the pit, they saw him. Vernon. He stood at the pit's edge, his back to them, perfectly still. He was no longer wearing his folksy cardigan. He was stripped to the waist. His skin was pale and translucent. A network of black, pulsing veins, identical to the cables on the floor, was visible beneath his skin, all converging at the base of his skull. One of the thick cables from the floor ran up his leg and plugged directly into the back of his neck, a grotesque, organic umbilical cord. He was not a drone being controlled from a distance. He was a part of the network, a terminal. Suddenly, Vernon's head snapped around, turning a full 180 degrees with a series of sickening, wet cracks. The black, empty eyes fixed on them. It had been aware of them the entire time. From the edge of the pit, a dozen more figures began to rise. Men and women, all with the same pale, translucent skin, the same network of black veins, the same empty, depthless eyes. The hollows. They weren't just victims. They were the next stage. They were the raw material for new drones, new appendages. The creature wasn't just feeding. It was reproducing. The humming stopped. The silver light in the pit died. A profound and absolute silence fell over the cavernous room. It was the silence of a predator that has stopped breathing, its full and undivided attention now fixed on its prey. Chapter 17. The Memory of a Name. The army of hollows moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They flowed up from the pit's edge, their movements silent and fluid, a tide of pale flesh and black eyes. They were not fast, but they were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. "The Transformers," Park yelled, her voice a sharp crack in the sudden silence. "Finn said they're still active, if we can cause a cascade failure." It was a desperate, long-shot plan. They scrambled back, away from the advancing horde, toward a row of monolithic gray cabinets that lined the far wall. The main circuit breakers. Hollies reached the first cabinet and wrenched the heavy door open. Inside was a dizzying array of switches, wires, and gauges. It was a language he did not understand. He had the memories of a detective, not an electrical engineer. The hollows were closing in. Park fired her weapon, the shots echoing like cannon fire in the vast space. The bullets tore through the pale bodies, but the impact barely slowed them. Like Vernon in the archive, they seemed to feel no pain, driven by a will that was not their own. One fell, only to be stepped over by two more. Holly saw a primary lever, a huge, red-painted switch labeled Emergency Shutdown. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled. The lever was frozen with a century of rust and neglect. It wouldn't budge. A hollow reached him, its pale hands grasping for his arm. The touch was cold, clammy, and shockingly strong. He kicked it away, the impact feeling strangely soft, like kicking a sack of wet sand. Another one took its place. "Hollies," Park shouted. She was being swarmed, forced back against a humming transformer. She clubbed a hollow with the butt of her empty gun. Scrap, despite his injury, was a snarling, snapping fury at her feet, trying to protect her. He had to move the lever. He braced his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. The faces of the hollows surrounded him, a gallery of empty, placid expressions. He saw a woman who could have been a teacher, a man in the tattered remains of a business suit, a teenager with headphones still around her neck. They were the city's forgotten, its erased, now repurposed as soldiers for the thing that had consumed them. And then he saw her. She was at the back of the advancing crowd, moving with the same slow, fluid grace. Jenna. Her face was as empty as the others, her eyes as black and depthless. The sight of her, a part of this grotesque army, a puppet of the monster, broke something inside him. The grief, the rage, the love he remembered but could not feel, it all came rushing back in a single, agonizing wave. It was not a memory, it was a feeling, raw, powerful, and utterly his own. His past was no longer a movie he was watching. He was living it. "Jenna," he roared, the name torn from his throat. The sound of her name, shouted with the full, resurrected force of his own identity, had an impossible effect. The hollow that was his ex-wife stopped. Her head tilted. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, confusion, recognition, a ghost of a ghost, passed through the black void of her eyes. The entire horde of hollows faltered, their synchronized movements becoming hesitant, their advance slowing as a ripple of psychic static passed through their network. The connection, the shared memories. The creature had eaten them, but it had not fully digested them. The emotional residue was still there, a vulnerability, a poison in the system. That single moment of hesitation was all he needed. With a final, grief-fueled surge of strength, he threw his entire weight against the lever. There was a groaning screech of tortured metal, and the huge switch slammed down. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The lights in the building did not just go out. They exploded in a shower of sparks. The deep, resonant hum was replaced by a deafening, high-pitched scream of dying machinery. The transformers began to arc, great, blue-white bolts of raw electricity leaping between them, turning the cavernous room into a cage of lightning. The hollows convulsed, their bodies rigid, as the power surge ripped through their network. The black veins beneath their skin glowed with a blinding intensity, then began to smoke. One by one they collapsed, their puppet strings cut, their bodies consumed by the very energy that had animated them. The great cables on the floor writhed like dying snakes, spitting sparks and fire. The entire building was a cascading, catastrophic failure. The heart of the beast was having a fatal coronary. A new sound rose above the din of the electrical storm, a psychic shriek of pure, undiluted agony. It was not a physical sound, but a wave of mental force that slammed into Hollies and Park, dropping them to their knees. It was the creature itself, the vast, central consciousness in the pit dying. The silver light in the pit flared, becoming a brilliant, solid column of pure energy that shot up toward the ceiling. The building groaned, the foundations shaking. The roof above the pit began to crack and splinter. "We have to go," Park screamed over the roar, grabbing his arm. "The whole place is coming down." They ran, scrambling over the twitching bodies of the fallen hollows. They half-carried, half-dragged the injured scrap with them. The air was thick with the smell of burning plastic and cooked meat. The structure of the building was failing, steel beams twisting and concrete dust raining from the ceiling. They reached the ladder and scrambled down into the relative safety of the steam tunnels just as the floor above them collapsed with a deafening, final roar, sending a tidal wave of dust and debris down the shaft after them. They were plunged into darkness, the only sounds their own ragged breathing and the distant, dying groans of the substation above. They had done it. They had killed the god in the machine. Chapter 18. The Scars of Memory. They emerged from the steam tunnels into the gray light of dawn. They were covered in grime, soot, and the dust of the substation's tomb. The city was quiet. The air, for the first time since Hollies could remember, felt still. The deep, subsonic hum that had been the constant, unnoticed soundtrack to his life was gone. The silence was vast, profound, and clean. They stood on the empty street, blinking in the morning light like survivors of a shipwreck washed ashore on an unknown continent. Scrap leaned heavily against Park's leg, exhausted but alive. "Is it over?" Hollies asked. The question felt too small for the scale of what had happened. "It's over," Park confirmed, her voice hoarse. She looked at him, her gaze searching his face. "Hollies, are you back?" He considered the question. He had felt it. The love for Jenna, the grief, the rage. The feelings had been real, powerful enough to move mountains of rusted steel. But now, in the calm after the storm, they were receding again, like a phantom limb that only ached under pressure. "I'm here," he said, which was the truest answer he could give. "But I don't know who that is anymore." The old Hollies was gone. The hollow Hollies was gone. He was someone new, built from the wreckage of the two. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. The city's emergency services, responding to the massive power outage and the collapse of the substation, were finally arriving. "They'll be looking for us," Park said. "We need to disappear." "No," Hollies said. He looked toward the approaching sounds, a strange sense of calm settling over him. "No more running. We can't tell them the truth, not the whole truth, but we can give them enough." When the first patrol car arrived, they found a man and a woman, exhausted and battered, sitting on the curb with an injured dog. They found two fugitives who had, by some unbelievable means, stopped the city's most notorious serial killer and uncovered a bizarre, cult-like operation in the heart of the city. The story that emerged was a carefully curated version of the truth. Julian Pike, the calligrapher, was the charismatic leader of a doomsday cult that had taken root in the city's homeless population. He had used a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation to create his army of hollows. The Bloodmobile was their recruitment tool. The substation was their temple. The official report would be a masterpiece of rational explanation for irrational events, a story the world could accept. Hollies and Park, in a closed-door hearing, would be hailed as rogue heroes, their previous insubordination forgiven in light of the extraordinary circumstances. Hollies visited Jenna in the long-term care facility where the surviving hollows were being studied. She sat in a sunny garden, her expression as placid and empty as it had been in her apartment. The destruction of the central creature had not restored them. It had simply left them unplugged. They were shells, living peacefully in the quiet aftermath. He sat with her for a long time, holding her hand. He could remember loving her with a perfect, painful clarity. He could access the memory, but the feeling itself remained a ghost, an echo in an empty room. He could not make it real again. He accepted it. It was a scar, a part of the man he was now. 2 months later, Holly's crew handed his badge and his weapon to a newly promoted Captain Una Park. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her new uniform stiff and unfamiliar. "I'm sure," he said. "The man who earned this badge, he's not here anymore, and I'm not a cop, not now." "What will you do?" He looked down at Scrap, whose leg had healed with a slight limp. The dog was his constant companion, a living link to both his past and his survival. "There are other hollows out there," he said. "The ones the harvester made before it nested here, before Pike. People who are just missing from their own lives. Someone needs to find them. Someone needs to tell their stories, even if they can't remember them themselves." He walked out of the precinct, not looking back. He was no longer a detective, haunted by a past he couldn't remember. He was an archivist of a different sort, a curator of the lives the harvester had tried to erase. He had lost his own story, so he would dedicate himself to preserving the stories of others. He and Scrap walked down the city street. The sun was out. For the first time, he did not feel like a stranger in his own skin. He did not feel whole, but he felt complete. The emptiness was still there, a quiet space inside him, but it was no longer a void. It was just a room waiting for new memories to be put inside. The end.